Literary criticism. Critical analysis of literary criticism. Understanding and interpreting literacy experience, even when not articulated, can be literary criticism. However, this can be an amateurish response. Alternatively, it could also be a highly sophisticated, professional one of the kind we generally read in review columns or journals. The poets and critic of English have battled over the question of the relative superiority or otherwise of criticism over creation. Wordsworth and Arnold, for example. Some enduring criticism has also come into being by way of defense of poetry. The classical criticism of the Greeks and Romans grew around attacks on and defense of the position of poets in a civil society. Aesthetics and poetics were terms that were earlier used before the vogue of criticism set in. In England, the literary criticism began during the golden era of Renaissance, but Chaucer, the father of English poetry and literature alike, shows the earliest signs of the critical spirit. His Monk defines tragedy more or less in the manner of Aristotle, and his Knight and Host condemn it for its depressing effect more or less in the manner of Plato. Tragedy is to say a certain story of him that stood in great prosperity and is fallen out high degree into misery, and endeth wretchedly. I say for me it is a great disease, whereas man hath been in great wealth and ease to hear of his sudden fall, alas. It was with the advent of Renaissance that the critical and rational spirit possessed thinkers and writers. The religious hegemony, especially of the Catholic Church, which had dampened both the creative and critical urges of human beings during the Middle Ages, was on the wane in the 15th century. The spirit of freedom was in the air. Free thought and free expression were the new ideals. It was an era in which Petrarch and Boccaccio, John Ball and Wycliffe, Chaucer and Longland, and finally Columbus, each in his different way testified to the right of the individual to feel, act, think and believe for himself, to pursue the openly paths that have been forbidden. Aristotle's criticism on poetry. Aristotle's Poetics is one of the greatest contributions to literary and critical theory. He was motivated to write it as a vindication of poetry on purely aesthetic grounds against its condemnation by his teacher, Plato. Stephen Hallowell remarks, Aristotle, like all educated Greeks, knew a great deal of poetry intimately, but it does not seem to have been among his deepest concerns, and he turned his philosophical attention to it perhaps chiefly because he saw ways of justifying this traditional element of Greek culture against his own teacher Plato, who had condemned poetry as false, immoral and psychologically damaging. Aristotle based his observations on existing Greek literature. He approaches the subject as the historian of poetry, and the rules that he formulated were not merely rules of Greek art but principles of art. It is because first, the Greek poets contain so much that appeals to universal human nature, and because next, Aristotle was able from the mass of literature before him to disengage and formulate this universal element. The laws that he discovers are those which were already impressed on the chief productions of the Greek genius. Aristotle was the first critic to give us the theory of poetry as opposed to its practice. He was the first to highlight the universal aspect of poetry and its representation of truth. He was the first to challenge the ethical view of poetry and assert that the primary function of poetry is to give pleasure. His interpretation of imitation is also his own. It is not twice removed from reality but an imaginative reconstruction of it, seeing the universal in the particular comedy no less than tragedy and epic. The poetic truths are of a higher order than those of historical, a fact which Plato could not perceive. Aristotle was the first to relate literature with life and the first to state the philosophical value of poetry to mankind. He was also the first to stress the psychological element in literature. What kind of plot, character and style, for instance, please men? He was the first to emphasize the supreme importance of unity in a work of art. Aristotle is indisputably the first of the systematic theorists of literary criticism, an early exponent of the historical and psychological methods. In the words of Saintsbury, it is impossible for anyone who undertakes the office of a critic to omit the study of Aristotle without very great harm. Being the first scientific critic of literature, Aristotle is the father of literary criticism. Although in literary criticism we have advanced at some points to further positions, says Saintsbury, over most of the grounds we are still engaged in consolidating the territory which Aristotle occupied. A lot of criticism of Renaissance was deeply influenced by poetics, as is clear from the pronouncements of Sidney, Ben Jonson and many others. Renaissance criticism added little of any value to Aristotle. Its chief business was to interpret him. The pseudo or neoclassicism of the 17th and 18th centuries was formed on the various interpretations of poetics. It was in the early 18th century that his influence and authority reached its zenith. During the Romantic era, the attention was focused on the text of the Poetics, its merit was recognized and its limitations were freely acknowledged. In the history of criticism, its importance is unquestionable and unrivaled. It is neither an infallible guide nor yet an antiquated textbook, but for breadth of outlook and sanity of judgment, for sheer penetrating power into the mysteries of art, the work is unrivaled, and modern theorizing has still to reckon with the context of its discreet, unromantic pages. Dante's contribution to literary criticism. Dante is the first great poet in the literary history of Europe, who analyzed thoroughly the problems which faced him in the composition of his own poetry. He was the first poet critic, who realized that literature of a high order, expressing natural and spontaneous feelings, could only be written in vernacular, but it must be the illustrious vernacular, the Latin tongue that lacked none of the grandeur of classical Latin. For this he distilled words to their noblest poetic residue, pointed out their highest construction, and laid down the subjects that lent distinction to both. By these means Dante naturalized the grand style in Italian. Summing up his memorable contribution to literary criticism, Abercrombie remarks, "Yet he can startle us with such complete anticipations, precisely argued, of modern theory, as his division of the power of language into signum rationale and signum sensuale, which is exactly our quite recent distinction of semantic and phonetic. And his division is reasoned from profound insight into the nature of language." No doubt his contribution to criticism, though its importance is only historical, is his defense of a national vernacular in literature against the specious claims of the universal language of learning, Latin. Marxist criticism. Marxist criticism asks questions which derive from the disciplinary formations of general aesthetics and literary criticism, and also from an autonomous Marxist theory. And, like most other critical theories, Marxist theory too has physical foundations, though it began by seeking to change the direction of philosophy. As Marx famously declared, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it." Marx divides up philosophy into the idealistic, Plato and Aristotle most notably, and the materialists. There are two kinds of materialists, mechanical and dialectical. The mechanical materialist basically thinks of life in terms of Newtonian physics. Everything is predetermined and predictable if only we had the apparatus to adequately apprehend it all. Dialectical materialism proposes that the world as we know it is the product of dialectical process which proceeds by means of thesis, leading to an antithesis, etc. In the opinion of Marx, this dialectical process leads to an infinitely rich sensuous manifestation, out of which human beings abstract experience. According to this, then all ideas exist only insofar as they are abstractions from objective experiences. How these ideas are arrived at is historically determined by the time period in which they arise, socially determined according to what resources the person generating the ideas comes from. While Marx himself does not say too much about this, later Marxists have brought to their studies a little bit of the old mimetic power argument, which says that art influences human behavior. The theoretical and political formulation of Marxism posed a distinct set of problems for literary criticism. The metaphorical representation of the socio-material reality has been widely disputed. Beginning with the contradiction between Marx's and Engels' views on the question of a relative autonomy of art and literature, questions have been asked and doubts raised about the dialectical mediation or interchange between the different levels of multiple and uneven structures of causality, and of the relative autonomy of some areas. Marxist theory has often presupposed a methodological separation between the two domains at the level of investigation.